Hello everyone, welcome back to Ancient Greece and Rome. In this video, we're going to discuss Archaic period Greece, as well as early classical Greece, from about the 800s BCE to about the mid-400s BCE. First, we're going to discuss Greek colonies during this period. Then we're going to discuss the definition of Greek spiritual and religious beliefs, specifically the Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses. We'll also discuss how Greek religious and spiritual beliefs impacted their death customs and burial rituals during this period. Then we'll discuss the Olympic Games and how this spiritual event brought the Greek people together. After that, we'll discuss Archaic and early classical Greek material culture. We'll discuss Greek pottery and sculpture and architecture, and how these forms evolved over time. Then we'll discuss agriculture and life outside of the cities of Greece. We'll discuss labor and class in ancient Greece, and how changes to Greek society during the Archaic and early classical periods gave rise to the emergence of Greek democracy in Athens. Finally, we'll finish our discussion by discussing the Greco-Persian Wars of the late Archaic and early classical years. We'll discuss the structure of the Greek city-states militaries, specifically the hoplite system. We'll talk about how the hoplite system reflected the values of Greek culture during the Archaic and early classical years. Then we'll discuss the course of the Greco-Persian Wars and the conclusion of this conflict, and how the end of this war set Greece up for its high and late classical period, and eventually its Hellenistic period as well. These periods will be the subject of future videos. As you remember from our previous video, many Greeks fled the Greek mainland during the Dorian Invasion and after. They set up colonies, settlements across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. In these colonies, these Greek refugees transmitted elements of their culture to the local people. This transmission and mixing of cultures was most evident in places like Sicily in Italy, called Magna Graecia by the Greeks of the time. In these settlements, the Greeks also learned from the indigenous peoples as well. This is particularly true of the settlements in places like Asia Minor and North Africa. The Greeks of the early Iron Age and Archaic period fled the chaos of mainland Greece. They traveled by sea, establishing new colonies across the Mediterranean, in places like North Africa, as well as further flung areas like what is now Spain, France, and Italy. They used ships like the one shown here to make these voyages. As I mentioned before, travel in the ancient world was much easier over water than it was over land. These colonies, some of which grew into true cities by Child's parameters, exported Greek culture across the Mediterranean. In these colonies, the Greeks also came into contact with other people groups, like the Iberians of what is now Spain, the Phoenicians of the Levantine coast in North Africa, and the Celts of what is now France, as well as the Etruscans and Latins of the Italian peninsula. These people would become the Romans. The Greeks brought their material culture with them. Here is an example: the Temple of Achaic in Sicily, built around the 500s BCE. You'll notice that this temple was built according to the Doric order of architecture. We'll discuss more about the Doric order later in this video. This is the remains of the Greek colony of Massilia. It's in the present-day city of Marseille, France. These ruins date to about the 600s BCE. The Romans also would inhabit this site, as do the French today, highlighting the strategic importance and ideal location of this Greek colony. Some more important points to consider when discussing Greek colonization. Remember, colonization for the Greeks began during what we often call the Dark or the Iron or pre-Archaic period in Greek history, but colonization will continue well into the Archaic period. The Greeks initially fled the chaos of the Greek mainland during the so-called Dark Age, but over time this colonization would evolve as the city-states, or the polis as the Greeks would have called them, looked to basically send away excess population, particularly young males, that there was no work for them, there were no opportunities for them in the polis, in the city-state. They'd be sent to establish a colony somewhere else. And a lot of these young men did not go willingly. They did not want to leave the polis, the city-state, but they basically were forced out by the city-state. So these people would go out and they would set up colonies, and these colonies were meant to be semi-independent from the metropole, or the founding mother city-state. Still, though, the colonies were expected to trade with the metropole and to be allies with the metropole during wars. This system of colonization is a lot less centralized than the European colonization of the early modern period that you might be more familiar with. And colonization reinforced a lot of important kind of Greek cultural ideas. One idea that's reinforced by colonization is the idea of pan-Hellenism. Pan as in meaning all in this case, all Hellenism, sort of an all-encompassing form of Hellenism or Greek culture, regardless of whether you were Spartan or Athenian or living in a colony like Massilia, you were still Greek. There's a shared language, there's a shared culture, there's a shared heritage. Although, of course, there is quite a bit of variation within Greek culture. There's different dialects of Greek that are spoken, and as you'll see in this slideshow, there's other variations, particularly between city-states like Athens and Sparta. Colonization would also reinforce and make even more important two other very important Greek values, xenia and arete. Xenia basically means guest and foreigner friendship in Greek. Greeks believe that they ought to treat their guests with kindness, even barbarians, and these interactions through the colonies with non-Greek people would have strengthened the Greeks' belief and use of xenia. At the same time, there's also rules as to how guests ought to behave with their hosts. So it's a two-way street, xenia. And then there's arete. Arete roughly translates to beauty or excellence. The pursuit of beauty, the pursuit of excellence, it's something that's pursued by both men and women in Greek society in some different ways. And the Greeks learned a lot of things from non-Greeks, from barbarians. This is facilitated by their colonization, living far away from the Greek homeland. At the same time, the Greeks also had a major impact and influence on the non-Greek and barbarian peoples they came into contact with in their colonies. This is especially true of Magna Graecia, or the Greek colonies in what is now Italy, where the Greeks had an influence on the other people living on the Italian peninsula, like the Etruscans, and of course, the Romans. One element of Greek culture that shows arete, the pursuit of excellence, but also a mixing of Greek and non-Greek ideas, is the alphabet, the Greek alphabet. The Greek alphabet is the oldest continually in use alphabet in the world. It would inspire later Cyrillic, Gothic, and Latin alphabets. The people who would become the Romans, they developed their own alphabet based on the Greek alphabet. There's also evidence that some of the people that the Greeks came in contact with, like the Celts, used the Greek alphabet for trade purposes. And of course, the Greek alphabet comes from the older Phoenician alphabet, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the Greek alphabet greatly facilitated the Greeks' trade and their colonization. Alphabets allow for writing. Writing is used for recording of goods, recording of business transactions, but also the Greek alphabet is a lot easier to use than other written languages and writing systems in the ancient world. And because it's easier to use, it allows for the development of Greek literature, things like epic poetry, the poetry of Homer that we discussed in a previous video. It allows for the development of theater, which we'll discuss in a future video, as well as scientific and philosophical texts. So the Greek alphabet is a very important development that is going to bolster Greek culture. Here's a diagram showing the development of the Phoenician alphabet and how the Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet for their own use, and then how the Romans adapted the Greek alphabet for their use over time. You'll see that the Phoenician alphabet evolves from a series of Canaanite pictographs or pictograms. For example, the symbol dig for fish eventually will become delta for the Greeks. You can see the evolution of these symbols. Now we'll talk about ancient Greek polytheism and ancient Greek religious and spiritual beliefs, which, like their written language, like their alphabet, are a mixture of ideas from other cultures. We'll start by talking about the Olympian Pantheon, the 12 Olympian gods. They're called the Olympians because they live on Mount Olympus, and they include Zeus, god of lightning and king of the gods, shown here. We've talked about quite a bit. Poseidon, god of the sea. Sometimes he's referred to as being a brother of Zeus in certain mythological stories. A very important deity to the ancient Greeks, a seafaring people. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, who, according to some legends, emerged from the head of Zeus. Ares, god of war. The Greeks have two gods, or two deities for war. We'll talk about some of the differences between Athena and Ares on another slide. Artemis, goddess of the hunt, a very important deity in a culture that's practicing hunting. Hermes, the messenger god. Hera, the queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, beleaguered wife of Zeus, because throughout Greek mythology, Zeus has relationships with a lot of other people in addition to his wife. Demeter, goddess of agriculture, very important for an agricultural society like the Greeks. Hephaestus, god of ironworking and metalworking, a very important deity. Apollo, a god of wisdom, but also a god of learning and science and education. We'll talk more about Apollo later in this video. Dionysus, god of wine and god of partying and festivities, a very fun god to study. And of course, Aphrodite, goddess of love. Aphrodite was married to Hephaestus, but she had a relationship with Ares. And not shown on this slide is Hades, god of the dead, because Hades does not live on Mount Olympus. He lives in the underworld. The Greek religion was based around the worship of the Olympian gods and goddesses. Some scholars argue that there were 12, others argue that there were 13 Olympians, depending on whether Dionysus, the god of wine, is considered to be a part of the Olympian Pantheon. The Greek religion may have evolved from older Indo-European spiritualities, especially the god Zeus, shown here on the left side of this slide, who bears many similarities to Thor and Odin, sky gods of the Germanic peoples. Zeus is much more like Thor and Odin in the respect that he wields lightning bolts. He's very different from the Egyptian and Mesopotamian sky deities, Amun-Ra and Anu, whom we discussed in previous videos. There are, however, some influences from the ancient Near East and Egypt, particularly on the goddesses Athena, Aphrodite, and Artemis. This sculpture is believed to be of Athena, and you can see the similarities in the sculpture work on her face to the Inanna mask we viewed in a previous video. In spite of some of these similarities, there are some very significant differences between the Greek pantheon and the gods and goddesses of the ancient Near East and ancient Egypt. In the ancient Greek pantheon, there's less combination with animals, although there are some exceptions, like the minor god Pan, who was half human form and half caprine, goat form. The Greeks believed their gods were far more civilized than those of the ancient Near East and of Egypt. If you read the myths the Greeks tell about their gods, though, their gods were really not very civilized at all, especially not Zeus, the king of the gods. Deities like Zeus had constant relations with human women, and many of these relationships were non-consensual. Some scholars argue that the ancient Greek pantheon, particularly elements like the sexual relationships that the male gods had with human females, may represent the patriarchal nature of Greek society. In spite of these stories and myths, though, women were allowed to become priestesses, which was one of the only ways that women could have power outside of the home in ancient Greek society. The gods lived atop Mount Olympus, highlighting the role that Greece's rugged geography played in the development of their civilization. The gods were a product of their environment, just as much as they were a product of the beliefs and desires of the ancient Greek people. Now we'll briefly discuss the differences between Ares, god of war, and Athena, goddess of war and wisdom. Ares was meant to convey the more negative aspects of warfare, the violence, destruction, murder. As mentioned before, Ares had a relationship with Aphrodite, even though she was married to another god. He's meant to show the more capricious and the more negative and dangerous aspects of war. Athena, on the other hand, is meant to show wisdom and the perhaps you could say the more positive aspects of war: tactics, strategy, planning ahead, the planning of battles and things like that. And both of these gods have their own symbols, highlighting the more negative aspects of Ares. He's symbolized by things like dragons and dogs and vultures. Athena is symbolized by owls, the symbol of wisdom, the spear, and the olive tree. This olive tree, of course, is a symbol for Athena because in a contest between Athena and Poseidon, a mythical contest between Athena and Poseidon for the city of Athens, or what would become the city of Athens, Poseidon gave the people that would become the Athenians a salt spring, spring full of salty water, which was useless to them, but Athena gave them an olive tree, which was very useful because olives could be eaten and then they could produce olive oil. So you see that Athena is the goddess of warfare in the sense that she's the goddess of careful planning, strategy, tactics, planning ahead in the case of an olive tree that takes years to grow, whereas Ares is the god of war and god of the more negative aspects of war, violence, destruction, etc. And there's many temples to Athena throughout the Greek world, but there's not nearly, proportionally speaking, as many temples to Ares, just because he's the not favorite god or deity of war. The Archaic and early Classical Greeks believed the Olympians were the offspring of an older set of deities known as the Titans. The Titans were much more elemental and pantheistic than the Olympians. The Titans included beings like Uranus, Father Sky, and Gaia, Mother Earth, as well as Cronus, Father Time. Some of the most important of the Titans were Cronus, mentioned before, and Atlas, shown here on the right-hand side of the slide. Cronus would eat his children to prevent them from conspiring against them, but he was defeated by Zeus. The triumph of the Olympians may have symbolized Greek spirituality's shift from an older pantheism to a more organized religion. The Greek myths held that after the Olympians defeated the Titans, they banished them to places like Tartarus, which was the ancient Greek religion's equivalent of hell. Or they forced the Titans to complete laborious tasks. Atlas, for example, had to hold up the earth. Archaic and early classical Greek burial customs and funerary rituals reflected the spiritual beliefs, but also the social beliefs of contemporary Greek people. The Greeks of these periods believed that the dead could not take many things with them into the afterlife. The tombs of these period were smaller. Most people were buried in cemeteries, like this one on the right, after a brief period of mourning, as shown in this image on the left. The Greeks did not mummify their dead. There's also less evidence of secondary burials, as was done in the Mycenaean period. Secondary burials, in archaeological terms, occur when a body is buried and allowed to decompose, and then its bones are placed in another tomb or catacomb alongside the bones of many other individuals. The Greeks of the Archaic and early Classical period shifted away from this style of burial. We don't really know why. Perhaps the Greeks of this period developed more of a fear of the dead, or perhaps they just didn't want to go through the effort of having to pick through the bones of the deceased people. Ancient Greek spiritual beliefs had rituals to help guide the dead away from the physical world and towards the afterlife. But these rituals and guidelines were far less extensive than those of the Egyptians, discussed previously. At certain points in history, the Greeks would bury their dead with a coin in the mouth so that the spirit of the deceased could pay Charon, the boatman, to pilot them across the river Styx into the Underworld, the realm of the dead. But the dead were not buried with other possessions, as other civilizations had done. The simpler burial rites of the Archaic and early Classical period, compared to the Tholos tombs of the Mycenaean period, highlight the more egalitarian nature of Archaic Greek and early Classical Greek society. The aristocracy was a lot weaker, and there were just a lot more middle class and everyday Greek people living their lives. Now we'll discuss the Greek underworld, also known as Hades. The spirits would cross the river Styx after paying Charon, the boatman, seen here at left. There are other rivers in the underworld as well, each with meanings of their own. Then the spirit of the dead would pass the three-headed dog Cerberus, who kept spirits from escaping Hades, seen here on the right. Sometimes humans of great power, like Heracles, also known as Hercules, would fight against Cerberus and chain him up so that they could go back and forth between the underworld and the physical world. The spirits would enter the underworld, and they'd be judged for their actions in life by Hades, god of the dead. Good people would go on to Elysium, which was like the ancient Greek version of heaven. The bad people would be punished in Tartarus, being tortured or forced to complete laborious tasks for eternity. Here's a piece of pottery that shows Sisyphus, who was trapped in Tartarus and forced to carry boulders for eternity. People trapped in Tartarus were also tortured as well, being dismembered by other animals, as among many other ways that they were tormented. Here's a simple map showing the layout of the underworld. Here's the river Styx. Here's Charon's ferry. Here's Cerberus and the gate. Here's the pavilion of judgment, where the souls of the dead would be judged. The good souls would go to the Isle of the Blessed, also known as Elysium. The bad souls would have to go into Tartarus and then would go on to eternal punishment. One way that Greeks could live a good, virtuous life and thus have a better afterlife for themselves was by making sacrifices to the gods. The ancient Greeks believed that they could honor the gods and feed the gods by sacrificing animals to them. The animal's flesh would be burned up, and the ashes and smoke would rise through the air to go to Mount Olympus to feed the gods. Sacrificial animals in Greek culture included things like sheep, but also swine and cattle or bulls. And these sacrifices would be paid for by Greeks who had some wealth. They would purchase animals based on how much wealth they had. Obviously, a pig or a sheep is going to be a lot less expensive than a bull. And these animals would be led to the temple, where they would be sacrificed by the priests. Before the sacrifice ritual, the animal would be honored and would be decorated with jewelry and things like that. The animal was supposed to not be afraid. It was not supposed to be resisting its impending demise. The idea was the animal was supposed to consent to being sacrificed. What they would often do is take a little bit of water and flick it basically into the eyes of the animal. And the sacrificial victim, the sacrificial animal, would then, trying to get the water out of its eyes, would nod its head, consenting to be sacrificed. And these sacrificial events, they were public rituals, and they were put on by the wealthier people. These were religious festivals for the public. They were public gatherings. The rich, the aristocrats, as the Greeks would have called them, would support poorer people who would come to these festivals, and then they would all together have a meal of meat from the sacrificial animals. Whatever meat was not burned and offered to the gods would then be consumed by the attendees of these festivals. And these events were called liturgies. And so wealthy Greeks, by making sacrifices, they would not only gain support from the gods, they would gain support from everyday commoner Greeks as well. The ancient Greeks of the Archaic and early Classical period believed that they could learn the will of the gods by consulting oracles. The most famous of these oracles was the Pythia, priestess of Delphi, who supposedly received visions from Apollo, the god of wisdom. Some archaeologists think the Pythia may have experienced hallucinations from toxic gases that leaked to the surface in Delphi. Priests would interpret the Pythia's hallucinations, saying that they were visions given to her from their deities. A city was built around the oracle site as pilgrims and travelers visited the Pythia, hoping to learn the will of the gods, as attested by documentary sources from the period. Here is the foundation of part of the city of Delphi. As you can see, it's a very extensive settlement settled in the mountains of Greece. Here's a reconstruction of the foundation of the oracle building where the Pythia spent most of her time. These images on the right-hand side of the slide show her being exposed to toxic gases as the priests look on and interpret her visions. The ancient Greeks participated in the Olympic Games right around the year 776 BCE. The Olympic Games would be held in the town of Olympia every 4 years to honor the gods, specifically Zeus. Other gods would be honored as well. Greek men and boys from all the city-states and colonies were permitted to compete. The Olympic Games were an important cultural event as well, especially for Greek people spread across the Mediterranean basin. It might be the one time these people would come together in common cause to worship their gods and to compete in athletic competitions. Events in the Olympic Games included things like running, jumping, wrestling, horse and chariot racing, discus and javelin throwing as well. These games may also have been a form of military training, especially in events like chariot and horse racing, javelin throwing, and wrestling. Most events were completed in the nude, Women were barred from competing in the Olympic competitions and had separate athletic events. The Olympics continued until the year 393 of the Common Era, when they were banned by the Roman Empire under Theodosius I. Here are some contemporary Greek pottery illustrations showing Olympic competitions. On the left, you can see a young athlete preparing for the long jump. The jumpers would hold weights in their hands so they could jump further. On the right, we can see a wrestling match between two competitors. Biting and gouging of the eyes was illegal in these events. As you can see, the referee is about to strike the competitors for breaking these rules. And of course, all the athletes are competing nude. Here is a plan of the Olympic site at Olympia. Basically, it's the ancient Olympian village. As you can see from the color of the buildings, this site was inhabited continuously for centuries and was expanded over the years. Here we can see the archaic buildings are fairly simple, but more buildings are added during the classical and Hellenistic periods. Classical, of course, in orange, Hellenistic in yellow. Even some buildings are added during the Roman period as well. Here are some slides showing the evolution of the architecture at Olympia. Once again, highlighting the long-term use and occupation of this site. On the right, we can see a Doric column. On the left, we see a series of Ionic columns. Here are some artists' recreations of Olympic events. On the left, you can see the hoplite race. The hoplite race was one of the few events in which the athletes competed wearing some kind of clothing. In this case, armor. It was an armored race, hence the term hoplite race. Here we see another image of Greek wrestlers. Athletes, especially wrestlers, would rub their bodies with olive oil before competing. The olive oil was a skin protectant, protecting them from cuts and scratches. It also made cleaning dirt off of their bodies more easily after they had competed. Here you also see the referee observing the fight to make sure both of the athletes play fair. Winners of Olympic events would receive a crown made from either laurel or olive leaves, as shown by this slide. They symbolically received this award, this crown, from Nike, the goddess of victory, shown here with the wings. Now that we've talked about the Olympic Games, I want to talk a little bit more about arete again and its meanings in Greek culture. As mentioned previously, arete meant excellence, but it meant excellence in all things. It meant basically being excellent, being beautiful, but being well-rounded, being well-proportioned, being good at many different things, what we might call being a Renaissance man. So ancient Greek athletes, their goal was not just to be good in one event, but to be good in multiple events. Unlike nowadays where Olympic athletes usually only perform in one sport. And of course, arete extends to beyond athletics. It also basically means virtue as well. The Greeks wanted to achieve arete in mind, body, and spirit. They achieved arete in body by participating in sports, by exercising, by training for military service. They achieved arete in spirit by worshiping the gods and being a good citizen. And they achieved arete in the mind by studying and learning. There's also some gendered qualities to arete as well. Both men and women pursue arete, but in slightly different ways. Men would seek arete through their military service, through their sense of honor, keeping their word, sports, and then maintaining their culture's sort of male beauty standards, being athletic, having a nice, neatly trimmed hair, having a nice, neatly trimmed beard, for example, wearing nice clothing.
Women sought arete by raising children and being good mothers, running the home, also by practicing xenia, basically friendship towards guests, and then of course by maintaining their own culture's female beauty standards, wearing nice clothing, having nice hair. We'll talk more about ancient Greek clothing and beauty standards on another slide. And of course, arete is an important value throughout the Greek civilization, and it's even an important value to modern day Greeks as well.
Now we'll discuss Archaic and early classical Greek pottery. Early in the Archaic period, in about the 800s and 700s BCE, potters began moving away from the geometric styles of earlier periods, the so-called Dark Age / Early Iron Age. The styles of pottery in the early Iron Age were very geometric. They did not feature human or animal figures, just designs. Archaic potters began to feature human and animal subjects on their ceramics, although these figures were very primitive and would evolve over time. Initially, there was a clear ancient northeastern Near Eastern influence, called the Orientalizing style by later scholars. Greek scholars would develop their own styles over time, coming up with the Black Corinth style around the 7th century BCE and the Red Athens style around 525 BCE. The ceramic seen on this slide is an early archaic design featuring primitive human subjects with geometric patterns as well. The first important pottery style that archaic Greek potters developed was the black figure style, developed around the 7th century BCE. Human animal figures are portrayed mostly in black. The backgrounds are lighter. Over time, the style of black figure pottery becomes more detailed as potters learned, or rather relearned, to make incisions, etchings in their pots to make their designs stand out. I say relearned because earlier Greek cultures did make incisions in their pottery, as we saw in a previous video. As the potters of this period became more skilled, they learned to represent action in their pottery, like Olympic contests, seen in this left-hand image, or battle scenes, seen here on the right. Here are some close-ups of black figure pottery. As you can see, the etchings and incisions allow the potters to make their figures more lifelike and to give them a sense of movement as well, as can be seen in both of these images. Over a century later, red figure pottery would emerge, around 525 BCE. The figures in red figure pottery are not actually red. They're more of a yellowish orange color. But the lighter color of the figures allows for much more detail. There's also more intricate incisions to represent shading as well. It makes these figures almost look 3D to the viewer. The potters of red figure pottery achieved this look through the use of paints, but also by mixing different types of clay, darker clay and lighter clay. Firing different types of clay can be difficult in order to keep the pots from cracking during the firing process, highlighting the increasing skill of Greek potters towards the end of the Archaic period. Red figure pottery is also much more likely to portray women as human subjects. This may be because the Archaic Greeks, just like the Mycenaeans and the Minoans preferred to portray women with lighter colors rather than darker colors. Here are some additional examples of red figure pottery. As you can see, the level of detail on human and animal figures in red figure pottery is much higher, because the potter can use etching and incision in multiple different colors to really make these figures pop and look lifelike. As mentioned before, women are more likely to feature in red figure pottery. Now we'll discuss Archaic and early classical Greek sculpture. Archaic and early classical Greek sculpture evolved significantly over time. Early sculptures, especially the Kuri shown here, were fairly simple, very stiff, few poses, not very anatomically realistic. There's clear ancient, Near Eastern, and Egyptian influence in their styles. The eyes of these figures look very ancient Near Eastern, as you'll remember, and their bodies are reminiscent of Egyptian sculpture. Very stylized anatomically, stiff, very little motion, arms down at the side, hands clasped in fists, and 1 foot forward. Over time, Greek sculptors would learn to experiment. They'd make new sculptures that were more anatomically accurate, lifelike, and they would also develop new poses as well. One big difference, though, between Greek sculptures and that of the ancient Near East and Egypt is that the Greek sculptures were not afraid to portray their male subjects nude. Here are some examples of the evolution of archaic and early classical Greek sculpture. These male Kuri figures, as I said before, show very little movement. 1 foot is put forward, but over time, the anatomical features become a bit more realistic and less stylized. The Near Eastern Egyptian influence is minimized as well, as the Greek sculptors develop their own unique techniques. Here are some more advanced Greek sculptures from the late Archaic and early Classical period. By now you can see the sculptures are much more anatomically realistic, much less stiff, and they just look a lot more lifelike. You'll also see that the hairstyles are more varied as well. Some of the sculptures feature male subjects with long hair, others feature subjects with shorter hair. Short hair on males became more popular later in the Archaic and during the Classical period. By the early Classical period, Greek sculptors were devising and using new poses for their subjects. These two sculptures on the left, one of which is made of stone, the other of which is made of metal, specifically bronze, show the god Zeus in two different poses. In one pose, he has a lightning bolt. The other pose, his lightning bolt has been lost. We also see there's much more detail to the anatomy and the muscles, much more realistic and lifelike, especially when compared with older sculptures of the Kuri style, like this one here. There's major differences, major evolution to be seen. Archaic and early classical sculptors depicted women in sculpture as well, although far less frequently. If these sculptors were portraying women, they were usually portraying goddesses. Early sculptures are very stiff, and the Egyptian and Near Eastern influence is very clear. You can see an image on the left. The woman's figure is very reminiscent of sculptures of Egyptian women, especially the arm at the side, the very narrow waist, the hair, and then the right arm placed over the chest. This was a common pose for women in ancient Egypt. We see it in sculpture. We even see it in female mummies as well. We also see an ancient Near Eastern influence in early sculptures of women in the Archaic period, such as this one here. The face bears many similarities to the Inanna mask, which we looked at in a previous video. Over time, the Archaic and early classical sculptors got better at sculpting women. Their sculptures became more anatomically realistic, their clothes became more complex and flowing, and they just look a lot more lifelike. Interestingly, sculptors in Archaic and early classical Greece did not portray women naked. You won't see statues of nude women until the Hellenistic period, the 300s BCE and later. We'll discuss the Hellenistic period in a later video.
Here are some examples of Egyptian sculpture that show the similarities between Egyptian and Greek archaic sculpture or orientalizing sculpture, particularly orientalizing Greek sculpture of women. The posture of the arm, placement of the arm, placement of the foot. You see these in Greek sculptures of women, and that they learned a lot of these styles from the Egyptians. While we're talking about orientalizing trends in Greek sculpture, I want to talk about what is often called the Black Athena hypothesis. And it started because Greek art, especially sculpture, shows significant Egyptian and Near Eastern influence in the Archaic period, as you saw in previous slides. This has led some scholars to posit that ancient Greek culture is primarily Egyptian and Near Eastern in its origin, rather than being European or being really a mix of other cultures. And this idea was articulated by a scholar named Martin Bernal in the late 1980s. Previous scholars who Bernal was trying to respond to had really sought to minimize the non-Western or non-European influences in Greek culture. And Bernal basically went in the opposite direction and arguably went too far. He argued that Egyptians had even done things like established colonies in Greece, and that the best elements of Greek culture came from the Egyptians. Archaeological and documentary evidence, however, do not corroborate Bernal's claims. Bernal mainly studied the similarities between Greek and Egyptian mythology, and that was how he came up with his Black Athena hypothesis. Of course, there's a lot of problems with Bernal's thesis. As you know, Greek culture is a mixture of Indo-European culture, cultures from the ancient Near East, cultures from Egypt, and then the Greeks themselves took all of these ideas and really made them their own and developed a lot of new ideas as well. Things like Archaic, Xenia, etc. And of course, the idea that Egyptian and black are the same thing is a bit confusing as well. The ancient Egyptians were a multi-ethnic society. There were sub-Saharan African black people living in Egyptian society, but the average Egyptian had a different skin tone, as you saw in our discussions of ancient Egypt in a previous video. I still thought that Bernal's book is worth mentioning because you may have heard of it. While we're on controversial subjects, I want to talk about pederasty and same-sex relationships in archaic Greece and in early classical Greece as well. And this is a figurine of the god Zeus and Ganymede, his young male lover whom Zeus kidnapped. And Zeus kidnapped a lot of people, both men and women, to be lovers, presumably against their will. But we'll continue talking about these relationships on the next slide. Before I begin my discussion of pederasty and same-sex relationships in ancient Greece, I want to say a couple of things first. First of all, I want to say that the ancient Greeks had a more fluid understanding of sexuality than we do today. I also want to say that in many ways the ancient Greeks were very open to same-sex relationships, But in other ways, they had a lot of rules and restrictions about how these relationships were to take place. So in other ways, we might say that they were perhaps more homophobic than people today. Really, Greek sexual relationships regarding people of the same sex, they show the duality of Greek culture and really its complexities. How you could have two seemingly contradictory things or paradoxical things happening at the same time. So, one very common homosexual relationship was pederasty, and this involved an older man, an Erastes, and a younger man, an Eromenos. Usually there was at least a 10-year age difference between the Erastes and the Eromenos. In ancient Greek visual art, the Erastes is usually portrayed with a beard, whereas the Eromenos is usually portrayed clean-shaven without a beard, or perhaps is meant to portray a young male that cannot yet grow a beard for himself. The Greeks did not have a word for homosexuality. Instead, they would engage in these relationships and not really be considered gay in the modern sense of the word. That's where the rules about how these relationships were to take place become very important. Greek society was highly patriarchal, and these relationships between men were supposed to prepare teenage males for marriage. Men typically would marry in their 30s, and they would marry women that were often in their teens. And you would learn how to be in a relationship by being in a pederasty situation. We might consider this type of relationship to be oppressive today because of the massive age gap between the Erastes and the Eromenos. Also because some of these Eromenoses would have become part of this relationship before they had reached adulthood, really when they were boys. So that's an area where we might look back on the Greeks in a more critical manner. Within the pederasty relationship, there were very strict rules about how sexual relations were to take place. And not every pederasty relationship was necessarily sexual. But the Orestes was not to engage in any kind of sexual act that would put the Eromenos in a passive position, in a receiving position, in a what might be called a female position to the Greeks. That's their terminology, not ours. Same-sex relationships between Greek men and non-Greek men and between slaves were far less regulated because non-Greeks, barbarians, were seen as having less honor than Greeks, and because slaves were slaves. Pederasty will become less common in the classical era, and it was even condemned in some cases by philosophers like Plato, although Plato often sort of changes his opinion about these relationships. Sometimes he has a more positive view of pederasty, at other points he has a more negative view of it. Pederastic relationships feature prominently in Greek literature, including Zeus and Ganymede, who I mentioned on a previous slide. Also, Achilles and Patroclus from the Iliad. Although at the time of Homer, that relationship was not necessarily understood as being sexual, but later Greeks will interpret Patroclus and Achilles' relationship as being sexual. And of course, there's other examples of Greek men in homosexual relationships, which we'll talk about later in the course. By the way, the image on this slide is a fresco from Magna Graecia, from what is now Italy, and it's from the 400s BCE. A little more information about Achilles and Patroclus. Homer did not explicitly define them as being lovers, but later Greeks did and interpreted their relationship as being a romantic one. If their relationship was an example of pederasty, though, it's a departure from the norms of pederasty. Achilles, who is nearly immortal and was said to be very beautiful and powerful, yet he was younger and better looking than Patroclus. But he was also the dominant figure in the relationship, being that he was nearly immortal. Whereas Patroclus would normally be the Erastes, is more in the subordinate role, and he basically is just trying to support Achilles and get him to take part in the Trojan War. In the end, Patroclus' death at the hands of Hector of Troy will motivate Achilles to rejoin the Trojan War. He had been kind of protesting and not fighting earlier after Agamemnon took a female servant named Briseis from him. So once again, you're also seeing that if Achilles was in a homosexual relationship with Patroclus, he was also trying to have heterosexual relationships as well with people like Briseis. And the image on this slide, of course, is famous Achilles bandaging Patroclus' wounds. It's from 500 BC, and it's from a cup that's actually in the Berlin Museum. I also want to talk about same-sex relations between women in ancient Greece. If you thought that same-sex relationships between men were taboo and controversial in Greek society, with pederasty and all of those rules about how males were supposed to treat each other in sexual relationships, it's even more taboo and more controlled when it comes to same-sex relations between women in ancient Greece. And we think this is a product of the patriarchal nature of Greek society. The best evidence of same-sex desires and relations between women comes from the poetry of Sappho of Lesbos. She lived from 630 to 570 BCE, so solidly in the Archaic period. She was a poet. Most of her work has been lost, and what work we do have from her is pretty fragmentary, and a lot of her poetry features longing and unrequited love between women, because these women would not be allowed to pursue relationships with other women, usually because they were married, and in ancient Greek society, men controlled marriage. Scholars debate whether Sappho was a lesbian or if she was bisexual. Lesbian, of course, comes from the term Lesbos, where Sappho was from. And remember, the Greeks had a much more fluid idea about sexuality. So some people say that trying to label Sappho as being bisexual or being a lesbian is pointless, because she would have had a very different understanding of sexuality when she was alive. And the image on this slide is of Sappho holding a lyre, an ancient Greek musical instrument similar to a harp, and it's from a crater, or basically a wine jug, at the Munich Museum.
Now we can discuss archaic and early classical architecture. The best examples of monumental architecture in the archaic and early classical period are temples. Greek palaces and tombs during this period are less impressive, highlighting the decreased stratification and increased egalitarianism and democracy of the period. Comparatively egalitarian and comparatively democratic by the standards of ancient times, of course. There's three major styles or orders: the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders. The Doric order was the oldest and was developed on the Greek mainland. And it's most popular from 750 to 480 BCE. The Ionic order was developed in Ionia, Asia Minor, and it's most popular from about the same period as well, but it spreads to the Greek mainland in the 500s BCE. The Corinthian order was developed in Corinth on the Greek mainland, and it's most popular during the late classical and Hellenistic period, from the 430s into the 300s. Multiple orders could be used in a single edifice/building. The best example of this is the Parthenon. We'll discuss the Parthenon in our next video. We're going to discuss some earlier examples in this video. Here are some diagrams of the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders. These diagrams also contain architectural terminology for the features of these styles. I don't expect you all to know and memorize all of these terms, but I've included them here so that you all can familiarize yourself with them. I'll be using and referencing some of these terms later. In the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders, columns are used to hold up the building's roof, also known as its entablature. The main part of the column is the shaft. The shaft is often decorated with fluting, seen here in this image. The top of the column is called the capital. The base of the column is called the base, or the pedestal. The entablature could be decorated with multiple architectural features, including triglyphs, metopes, and friezes, among others. We'll discuss some more of these architectural features later. Here are some specific features of the Doric and Ionic orders. Both Doric and Ionic columns feature fluting, these grooves on the column shaft, although their capitals are different. The capitals of Doric columns are much simpler, as you can see comparing the capitals of these two types of columns. Interestingly, the Doric order decorates the frieze with triglyphs, while the Ionic order does not. Also, keep in mind that ancient Greek architects often mixed both orders together in the same building. Here's an example of a temple built according to the Doric order. It is the Temple of Paestum in Italy, also known as Magna Graecia. It was built between 550 and 450 BCE. Notice how thick the Doric columns are. Here is an example of some Doric columns at the Temple of Athena in Ionia from about 530 BCE. As I mentioned, Greek architects would mix styles. It's possible that Ionic styles were used in this temple as well, and that they've just been lost, with only the Doric columns surviving. Here's another example of a Doric temple. This is the Temple of Poseidon, god of the sea, in Greece, built between 444 and 440 BCE, the early classical period. As you can see, it's built primarily with the Doric order, but there are more carvings and more decoration on the column's capitals, suggesting a possible Ionic influence to this mostly Doric structure. Here's an example of an Ionic structure built at Miletus in Ionia during the 6th century BCE. Notice that the columns in the Ionic order are much thinner. We'll talk more about that later. Here is an Ionic temple built in Greece at Athens. It's the Temple of Nike. It's built near the Parthenon in the Acropolis complex, an area where both Doric and Ionic orders of architecture are used, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of the city of Athens, as they mixed different orders together. Another Ionic temple in Athens, once again highlighting how Athenian architects brought multiple architectural styles together to show the complexity and diversity of their city. Now we'll compare the Doric and Ionic orders alongside each other. The Doric order, as I mentioned, was much simpler, and it was most popular in the Greek mainland and in Greece's western colonies. The Ionic order was more common in Asia Minor and colonies in the eastern part of the Greek mainland, like Athens. Doric columns tend to be thicker with wider fluting, which scholars argue was meant to symbolize the masculinity of Doric architecture. Ionic columns are thinner, with more delicate fluting, more ornate design on the capital as well, This design is called volutes, and it's believed to have represented a woman's hair, symbolizing femininity. Ancient Near Eastern influence is more evident in the Ionic order, which makes sense because it was developed in Ionia, Asia Minor. These orders could be combined and used together, even in the same building complex, as seen with the Parthenon and the Acropolis. Now we'll discuss ancient Greek agriculture and society during the Archaic and early Classical period. Land use patterns in Greece changed after the Bronze Age collapse and the fall of the Mycenaean civilization. Instead of a large population of destitute peasants working the land to support a king and an aristocracy, farmers in the Iron Age and then in the Archaic and early Classical periods worked the land for themselves and sold their produce at urban markets. They didn't become rich, but they became well off enough to sustain themselves. Farmers would grow grains like wheat and barley, and they would raise olive trees for oil and to eat the olives. Some even kept vineyards to make wine, and some kept herds of sheep or goats to provide milk, textiles, and meat. They also would have kept oxen to pull their plows. Olive trees, probably the most valuable of all of the Greek farmers' agricultural produce, can live for centuries, but they mature very slowly. They take at least 4 years to fruit, and they're an alternate year bearing crop as well, meaning that one year they'll have a very large crop, the next year they'll have a small crop, and the year after that they'll have a large crop again. The loss of a wheat or a barley crop would have been difficult for ancient Greek farmers, but the loss of an olive tree could have been cataclysmic. Olive oil had many uses in Greek society. It was an essential ingredient in their cuisine, and it could be used to make medicines and cosmetics, like moisturizers, which athletes rubbed on themselves to protect their skin during athletic competitions. Here are some images of ancient Greek architecture. On the left, we see a vase depicting farmers harvesting olives. They would use sticks to knock the olives from the tree, and they would set a blanket on the ground to catch the fallen olives, which they would collect and then either eat or dry, or they would press into olive oil. On the right, we see farmers driving oxen in their fields. The oxen can be seen pulling plows. Here's a modern artist's recreation of a Greek farmer at work. You can see him leading a plow of oxen. He is joined by another male, perhaps a son or a paid worker who is sowing seeds that will presumably grow to become a wheat field. Off to the in the background is a vineyard where grapes will be grown, and then grapes could either be eaten as fresh or as raisins, or they could be made into wine. Wheat, of course, would be made into bread, and then there's olive trees as well. Olive trees produce olives. Olives can be eaten, and olives also can be produced, used to make olive oil, which is a essential foodstuff, cosmetic item, and medicine in Greek society. And these men here might be hired laborers, or they might be slaves. Many farmers owned slaves who worked in the fields alongside them. The ancient Greeks also engaged in fishing. Remember, the Greeks are a maritime people, a seafaring people, and they use the ocean not only as a way to travel more easily than traveling by land, but also the ocean could be a source of food, particularly through fishing. And fishing and fish feature prominently in Greek visual art. Here is an artist's modern recreation of what an ancient Greek fishing vessel might have looked like. The farmers would then take their produce to the urban markets, where they would sell it and purchase other goods, like agricultural implements or livestock, which they would raise on their farms. The ancient Greeks also enjoyed wine as well. They raised vineyards, they pressed their grapes, and they fermented their grapes into wine. And they would store the wine in jars called amphora. Then they would export their wine all across the ancient Mediterranean, usually by ship. Shipwrecks often feature wine jars like these.
In addition to selling goods outside of Greece, the Greeks also sold goods within Greece at marketplaces in cities called agoras. The agora was an open-air outdoor marketplace, usually in the town square in the center of the polis. And the agora basically replaces the megaron or great hall of the Mycenaeans. It reflects the more democratic nature of Greek society, as Greek people come together in a common space to buy and sell and trade goods, rather than going to a centralized throne room to have their goods redistributed. And unlike the Mycenaean economy, which was a redistributive system, the Archaic and later Greek economies, even beyond the Archaic period, are market-based, with people buying, selling, and trading, bartering goods for themselves. And Greeks bought and sold a variety of goods in the agora. They also would engage in military training in the agora, as you can see here. Public meetings and votes would take place in the agora, especially in places like Athens. And then, unfortunately, there were also slave markets, the buying and selling of human beings in the agora. And really, the agora for the Greeks was not just a place of business. It was a community center for Greek culture. People would gather together, as I said. They'd gather together for military training, public meetings, the buying and selling of goods. There would be poetry recitations. There would be sacrifices out front of the temples. Things of this nature took place in the agora, the marketplace. Because we mentioned slave markets on the previous slide, I want to talk a little bit more about slavery in ancient Greece. Slavery played a major and an important role in the Greek economy and in the Archaic period and even beyond. A lot of Greek city-states, because of the amount of slaves, the number of slaves they had, will be considered slave societies, that is, societies dependent on slave labor. And because of the dependence that Greek societies had on slave labor, the average Greek person who was not a slave, the average free Greek person, believed that slavery was a natural and necessary system. Obviously, enslaved people amongst the Greeks would have had a different idea. And slavery varied somewhat, though, from one city-state to the next. For example, Athens practiced what we would call chattel slavery, that is, slavery in which human beings are treated like property and they're bought and sold like livestock, often at markets like the one shown on this slide. Slaves could also be owned by the polis, by the city-states, and these were called public slaves, and they would have done things like cleaning up the streets and doing maintenance on city buildings and things of that nature. In Greek society, slaves tended to be foreigners or barbarians brought from outside Greece. Foreign captives might also be, from warfare, might be made into slaves as well. Many Greeks thought it was inappropriate to make other Greek people slaves. So even as they thought of slavery as being a natural and necessary thing, they thought it was wrong and immoral to enslave other Greeks. Of course, there will be exceptions. Sometimes that sort of thing will happen, even though it's considered to be taboo and immoral in Greek society. Slaves in Greek society could purchase their own freedom if they were able to make enough money, and then they would become metics. And metics were free people living in Greek society, but they were not citizens. An exception to the chattel slavery system, as seen in places like Athens, was a Spartan system of slavery. And the Spartan system of slavery was based around what were called the helots. And helot means captive in Greek. And the Helots were like slaves, but also very similar to almost like medieval serfs. They were tied to the land. They could not be bought and sold. They could not be separated from their families in the same way, that other slaves were in Greek society. And also, the Helots were Greek. They were Greeks being ruled over by other Greeks, Spartans. So the rule of not enslaving Greek people didn't really apply in Sparta. And there's a lot of debate about which type of slavery was better or worse for slaves in ancient Greece. Nowadays, scholars generally argue that actually the Athenian way of chattel slavery was better than helotry, the slavery of the Spartans, because an Athenian slave could potentially purchase her or his freedom and become a free person, a metic. And while they were not a citizen, they were free. However, amongst the Spartans, the Helots were always going to be in a subordinate position to the Spartans, and then to free people who were living in the Spartan society. Also, the Helots, even though they did not have their families separated and they were not bought and sold, they did have to deal with something called the Crypteia. This was a military rite of passage in which young Spartan warriors would kill Helots that were believed to be rebelling against the Spartan society. Also, the Spartans had a lot of other really strange rules designed to degrade the Helots and make them feel inferior. In addition to being killed by these Crypteias, they also had to wear clothing made of dog skin, for example. Very strange rules that were designed to degrade the Helots and keep them from rebelling. So those are some important things to keep in mind when we're discussing slavery in ancient Greece. Now that we've discussed slavery in ancient Greece, we can discuss gender relations in a bit more detail in ancient Greece. From the Archaic period and really beyond. Many of these points that we're going to make about the Archaic period are true of later times in Greek history. As mentioned before, Archaic Greece, and really Greece afterward, was a very patriarchal society. Women did have basic human rights. They could appear in court, but they could not testify on their own behalf. They would have to have a man testify for them in court, whether it was their father, their husband, a brother, perhaps a son. Women were, however, heavily involved in the economic production in Greece, especially domestic economic production like weaving. Women would work as weavers in the home, women of the middle and upper class. Upper and middle class women were expected to work within the home, and really they were expected only to leave the home when it was absolutely necessary. They would go out for religious observances and things like that. Women often were priestesses in Greek society. Working class women were allowed a little bit more wiggle room in these gender relations. Working class women were more likely to be permitted to work outside of the home to make money for themselves and for their families, whereas middle and upper class women were supposed to work, but inside the home for their husbands and their sons. And of course, a lot of these gender rules did not apply to enslaved women. Enslaved women had to do whatever their master or mistress told them to do. Women could not become citizens in the same way that men could, and they could not vote. And there were also additional laws about how women were supposed to dress and carry themselves in public. Sumptuary laws about clothing. Women were supposed to keep their heads covered with a scarf of some kind in public. Women were supposed to oversee domestic labor, weaving cloth, as I mentioned before, raising children, cooking. These things were seen as being the domain of women in Greek society. And women married very young in Greek society. They typically married in their teens, often to men that were 10 or more years older than them. And we would consider this kind of age difference between a man and a woman to be oppressive today in our society. But for the Greeks, this was a very normal thing. Marriages would be arranged by male guardians, usually the potential bride's father and the potential groom's father. Women often did not have a lot of say in who they were supposed to marry. That doesn't mean that these marriages could not be loving, though. Men and women who were married did often love each other in ancient Greek society. These arranged marriages were considered to be the norm, so these are not mutually exclusive things, a relationship or a marriage of love and a relationship or a marriage of convenience. For the Greeks, they could be one and the same. And women's sexuality was tightly controlled. Infidelity was extremely frowned upon for women. There were very harsh penalties for women that committed adultery, that had sex outside of marriage. For men, having sex outside of marriage, it was not really a problem, so long as the woman that they had sex with outside of marriage was not married. Women were, of course, not permitted to have these relationships outside of marriage. Divorce was actually permitted in ancient Greek society, but it had to be initiated by men. So the terms of the divorce would often be very unfavorable to women. Here is a terracotta lekithos, or olive oil vessel. It's from Attica, 560 through 530 BCE. It's in the Met Gallery of New York City, and it's showing an archaic Greek marriage procession as the bride leaves her home to go join the home of her husband. This is a patriarchal society, but also a patrilocal society, meaning that the bride becomes part of the groom's family. Now that we've talked about archaic Greek gender relations, I want to talk about ancient Greek fashion as it developed in the Archaic period and would continue even beyond the Archaic period. Compared to the Minoan and Mycenaean periods, Greeks wore less revealing clothing during the Archaic and early Classical periods and beyond. During the Archaic period, women wore tunics called the peplos, which would be fastened with pins at the shoulder. Men wore tunics that were called chitons, and they were closed with buttons or sometimes with brooches. Over time, women began to wear a version of a chiton as well, but their chitons were longer and more like a dress than a tunic. Both sexes would have worn cloaks and head coverings of some kind in colder weather or outside of the home. Men often wore wide-brimmed hats or caps of a variety of types, and women often wrapped cloaks around their heads. Especially when they were out in public, it was considered to be a sign of modesty for a Greek woman to have her head covered in public. Women usually kept their hair long in Greek society, and they wore it in a variety of hairstyles, either up or down, different types of braids and styles. Men in the Archaic period typically wore their hair long, although shorter hair would become more popular in the Classical period, as you can see on the slide. In Greek society, mature men would grow facial hair. Younger men would shave until they could grow a thick beard for themselves, although the clean-shaven style would become a lot more popular towards the end of the Classical period and at the beginning of the Hellenistic period. Women also wore cosmetics and would remove their body hair as well in a variety of ways. Both sexes would have worn open-toed sandals in most weather. Trousers in ancient Greek society, that is pants, were rarely worn by Greeks, and they were identified with barbarian cultures. They were seen as being barbaric. Here are some additional images of clothing from ancient Greece, from the Archaic period and beyond. You can see the chiton worn by women. It's closed with buttons along the shoulders and arms. Women's tunics are a lot longer, more like a dress. Men's tunics are much shorter, allowing them to more easily move and work in the fields or to take part in combat, reflecting the gendered division of labor in ancient Greek society. Perhaps the greatest Greek cultural development of the Archaic and the early Classical period, far more so than architecture or arts or anything along those lines, is the development of Greek democracy. Before the early 500s BCE, so for most of the Archaic period, a lot of the Greek city-states were ruled by kings called tyrants. And this, of course, is monarchy, the rule of one. Also, some city-states were ruled by oligarchies. Oligarchy means rule of the few. And oligarchies could look like a society like Sparta, which was ruled by a council of elders and a couple of kings. We'll talk more about Spartan society in a future video. In 510 BCE, Athens expelled its tyrant, and led by the reformer Cleisthenes, created the first Greek democracy. And of course, democracy is demos, people, and kratos, power. You can see Cleisthenes here on this slide. Cleisthenes is built upon the reforms of the previous Athenian statesman Solon, who lived from about 630 to 560 BCE. In Athenian democracy, adult male citizens, men over the age of 20 who were citizens and had been born in Athens, could vote. There were equal rights for all citizens, although only free males over 20 years of age could actually be citizens, not 18-year-olds, not 16-year-olds, you had to be 20 or older. Although there were certain property qualifications for which office, political office in Athens you could hold at the time of Cleisthenes. But Athenian democracy takes different forms at certain points in Greek history. This is just an overview of Athenian democracy. The electorate, the voters, would be divided into districts. They would vote for their leaders. Athenian democracy started out as a representative democracy, became a much more radical or direct democracy over time, in which things like property requirements for certain types of office were abolished. We'll talk more about the evolution of Greek democracy in future videos. Athenian democracy also had a series of courts called dikasteria, and punishments would be voted on by an electorate or the assembly, basically the jury, would pass judgment. A very common punishment in Athenian democracy was ostracization or exile, being forced to leave Athens for a set number of years, usually. In some cases, ostracization could be for life. The assembly or the ecclesia met in the Athens agora market. We think that democracy in Athens would not have developed without a large population of semi-independent, self-sufficient farmers who could feed both themselves and the city dwellers who oversaw manufacture, basically division of labor, and then independence and self-sufficiency helped to make Athenian democracy work. We don't think that democracy could have developed in a previous Greek society like Mycenaean society with its redistributive economy where everyone basically had to have their goods redistributed. In Athenian society where the population was more self-sufficient, democracy was able to develop and flourish. And democracy would continue to develop under the reforms of Ephialtes in 462 BC and really throughout the classical period as well, with some interruptions in which democracy would be suspended. But we'll talk about those interruptions in a future video. Other city-states during the Archaic period and early Classical period would develop more egalitarian political reforms, but few Greek city-states went as far as Athens did in their democracy. And this is one other point I want to make. To the Athenians and really to the Greeks, the idea of aristocracy and democracy were not mutually exclusive. To the Greeks, aristocracy meant rule of the best. That's literally what democracy means. And basically, democracy was the best way to have aristocracy. The electorate would vote for the best, most qualified citizens and give them power. And these best, most qualified citizens would become the leaders of Athens, the archons, the strategoi, etc. Nowadays, we generally think of democracy and aristocracy as being the opposites of each other. Aristocracy is people who have power because of their parentage and their lineage, whereas democracy is the people voting to give others power. But for the Greeks, aristocracy was not about lineage. It was about just being the best. It was about having the most arete.
Here is an archaeological excavation of the Agora at Athens, as well as an artist's reproduction of what the Agora may have looked like in archaic and early classical times. The ecclesia met in the Agora, and the courts met nearby as well. The ecclesia used pieces of pottery as ballots for their votes. They would use broken pieces of pottery, which the voters would write on, or for more important votes like ostracizations, they would use specially made clay tokens to prevent voting fraud. Now that we've discussed archaic and early classical Greek society, we can discuss how the Greek military of these periods was a reflection of Greek society and values. The backbone of the Greek military during the archaic and classical periods was the hoplite. They were named after their round shield called the hoplon. Hoplites were considered heavy infantry, equipped with full armor, shields, and swords and spears, and they would fight in close order in what was called the phalanx. Hoplites were generally not professional soldiers. They were citizen soldiers who had regular professions, especially in agriculture, and they would volunteer to fight. In some cases, they were conscripts in places like Athens, where the citizens, once again, free adult males, were expected to fight as part of their civic duty. There were some professional soldiers and professional military classes, though. Sparta had professional military classes, men trained to fight from the age of 7. Some Greeks fought as mercenaries as well. The hoplites fought in tight formations, which would have required high levels of discipline. The hoplites would be supported by cavalry and unarmored light infantry called peltasts. Peltasts were armed with ranged weapons like javelins, slings, and archers were used as well, but to a lesser degree. The Greeks preferred melee combat. As mentioned before, hoplites tended to come from agricultural communities. They were usually of middling status. They had to be in order to pay for their armor and weapons. Poor men who wanted to serve in the military might do so as peltasts, light infantry. Rich men were more likely to serve in the cavalry because they would have to be able to pay for their own horses. The Greek city-states frequently fought each other during the Archaic and early Classical periods, but they came together in leagues to fight external threats like the Achaemenid or Persian Empire. As you can see, the hoplite system reflected the comparatively egalitarian nature of the Greek society during the Archaic and early Classical period.
Now I want to talk a little bit more about the class systems of the Archaic and early Classical Greek military. Even though in many ways Archaic and early Classical Greece was highly egalitarian by the standards of the ancient world, there were still class systems in place, particularly in how the military was formed and funded. In Athens, the reforms of Solon, who I mentioned on a previous slide, basically determined who would serve in the military and in what capacity. Basically, at the top of society, you had the 500 measure men. These were the wealthiest male citizens whose property or estate could produce 500 measures of wealth per year. And they would serve as counselors, archons, and then strategoi, or generals, in the Greek military or the Athenian military. Underneath the 500 measure men were the 300 measure men. And these men would have served as hippiases or cavalry, which were more in a secondary role in the Greek military. There were not enough men who were wealthy enough to be cavalry. And these men had to have 300 measures as their annual income. They were basically, we might say, lesser aristocracy. They were not the best of the best, but they were, best men. Underneath the 300 measure men were the 200 measure men, also known as the yoked men, because they were yoked together in the phalanx. They were closely put together in close order formations in the Greek phalanx. They served as hoplites. And they did not have enough money for a horse. Typically, these were farmers who would have had oxen, not horses. And they would have been farmers of the middle class, perhaps some artisans as well, people who could afford the armor to be a hoplite, and who also might have been able to afford a armor bearer. They could hire a man to carry their armor for them, or they could afford to have a slave carry their armor for them. Under the 200 measure men were the thetes. They were citizens, but they were wage laborers, working class people who could not afford hoplite armor. And they usually served as either light infantry, men who had no armor, but instead would use slingshots to sling stones at the enemy. They'd also serve as armor bearers for the 200 measure men, or they could serve as rowers on naval vessels. Naval vessels were very important in the Greek military. The Greeks are a seafaring society. And other Greek city-states would adopt similar structures for their citizen soldier armies. That is, if the city-state had citizen soldier armies. These are men who are citizens who have civilian occupations, and they will come together for brief periods to serve in the military. A notable exception is Sparta, which had basically a standing army. It had its citizens primarily serve as soldiers first, and then their civilian careers were not prioritized.
Here are some images that illustrate hoplite tactics, moving slowly and decisively in the tight phalanx formation, with spears out and swords at the ready. You can see their heavy armor, their shields called hoplons, their helmets, and even their greaves to guard their legs. Here are some modern reenactors reenacting a phalanx. Sometimes the hoplites would decorate their shields with personal designs. In other cities, like Sparta, the hoplites did not decorate their shields, but instead had the symbol of the city, the letter lambda, on their shields. Here are some images of ancient Greek helmets, which changed significantly during the Archaic and early Classical periods. The Corinthian helmet, shown here on the left, was most popular during the Archaic period. It provides great protection, but it obscures the wearer's vision, hearing, and vocalization. Later helmets, like the Illyrian helmet, shown here, offered less protection, but better use of the senses. And the Pylos helmet, center, offered even less protection, but it was much cheaper to manufacture than earlier helmets. Here are some more views of the hoplite armor. The armor was usually made of bronze, although sometimes iron was used. Swords and spears, however, were made of iron by this point. Here's an example of a Spartan warrior. Once again, we see that he does not have a customized personal shield. He has the symbol lambda for Sparta on his shield. Interestingly, this soldier is not wearing bronze or iron for his breastplate or cuirass. He's wearing one made of linen, which is much cheaper, but far less protective. Here are some images of peltasts. They wear much less armor, if any. They use javelins and slingshots, and their goal was to harass the hoplites into breaking formation. Here are some images of ancient Greek cavalry, known as the Hippias. They generally had a more secondary role in ancient Greek tactics. They were armed with javelins or long spears, basically lances, and they would attack hoplites that had been separated from their phalanxes, as shown on this relief here. The ancient Greek city-states, especially Athens, had navies to protect their trade and to protect their ports. The preferred Greek military vessel, the battleship of the day, was the trireme, a light, fast ship with 3 levels of rowers. Contrary to popular opinion, the rowers on these ships were not slaves, chained to the vessel, doomed to drown if it sank. They were free men who were paid a wage to row in the galleys. Usually these were poorer men who could not afford their own weapons and armor to fight as hoplites. With this background about the archaic and early classical Greek military out of the way, now we can discuss the Greco-Persian Wars. The Greco-Persian Wars were a series of intermittent conflicts fought between the Greek city-states and the Achaemenid Empire from about 499 to 449 BCE. Although the conflict began a little bit before 499, but I'll talk about that in a moment. The Greco-Persian Wars are best documented by the Greek historian Herodotus. Later historians like Thucydides wrote about them as well. As you can imagine, Herodotus, being Greek, his perspective on the war is very pro the Greek city-states and very anti the Achaemenid Empire. The main reason for going to war, the casus belli, was the expansive Achaemenid Empire had taken over Greek colonies in Ionia, Asia Minor. The Greek colonists of Ionia resented being in the Persian Empire, and the Greek city-states supported their revolts. In response to the Greek city-states' support of the Ionian revolts, the Achaemenid Empire, specifically under King Darius, decided it would go to the seat of the problem and invade the Greek mainland. The invasions began about 492 BCE. Both sides fought primarily with infantry, but the Achaemenids preferred large armies of light infantry, the immortals that we discussed in the previous video. The Greeks preferred smaller forces of heavily armed hoplites. Both civilizations, the Achaemenids and the Greeks, had developed grand strategies that fit with their civilization's strengths. The Achaemenid Empire, as you remember, was very large and populous and diverse, so they built these large multi-ethnic armies in the form of the immortals. The Greeks were a collection of small city-states with a far smaller population, but they had a reasonably large middle class that could afford significant amounts of weapons and armor. Basically, the Greeks preferred quality over quantity when it came to armies. Here's a map showing some of the most important battles fought in Greece during the Greco-Persian War. You can see the Battle of Marathon, fought in 490 BCE, followed by the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC and the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE, after which the Battle of Plataea was fought in 479 BCE, and the major battles fought in the Greek mainland during the Greco-Persian War came to an end. We'll discuss these battles now. The Battle of Marathon was fought in September of 490 BCE, shortly outside of Athens. I'll let you guess how far Marathon was from Athens. The Greek forces from Athens primarily were heavily outnumbered by the Persian Achaemenid forces. Some scholars estimate that the Persians may have had as many as 110,000 troops, whereas the Greeks may have only had 10,000. Some scholars argue that the majority of the Persian forces were rowers taken from their ships who were only lightly armed. Either way, the Persians significantly outnumbered the Greeks. But the Greeks developed a strategy and used tactics that played to their strengths. They built a series of abatis, sharpened sticks driven into the ground, along the flanks of their forces, forcing the much larger Persian army to come straight at them. There were also marshes and hills on either side of the Greek army, funneling the Persian forces into a much larger, much smaller area. In military history terms, this is called a force multiplier for the Greeks. It allows a smaller force to face a much larger one in pieces. In the end, the battle was a massive success for the Greeks. They routed the Persians, even though they had sent out for help from Sparta. The runners, the Athenians, dispatched to Sparta, had to run a lot further than 26 miles, the distance from Marathon to Athens. They had to run over 150 miles to reach Sparta. One of the runners, Phidippides, made it from the battlefield all the way to Sparta, carrying the message calling for reinforcements, only to promptly die from the exertion. Now we'll discuss the Battle of Thermopylae, probably the most famous of the battles of the Greco-Persian War. It's been portrayed in numerous forms of media, including films, some of which are much more accurate than others. This slide shows images from the film 300, which came out in 2006. At the Battle of Thermopylae, fought in the summer of 480 BCE, between 70,000 and 300,000 Persians faced about 7,000 Greeks. The Greeks were led by King Leonidas of Sparta and his 300 troops. The Greeks, heavily outnumbered, held their own against the Persians at the beginning, until the Persians discovered a mountain pass around the Greek position. The historian Herodotus describes how the Greeks were betrayed, leading to the Persians finding this mountain pass. The Persians then were able to surround the Greek force and destroy it. The battle was a massive victory for the Persians. But the sacrifice of the Greek soldiers, particularly the 300 Spartans, galvanized the disunited Greek city-states together to resist the Persians. After the Battle of Thermopylae, the Persians continued towards Athens, where they burned the city, but this act only further intensified Greek resistance. Here are some images of the pass at Thermopylae. You can see how steep the mountains are, how difficult it would have been for the Persians to pass by the Greeks without knowing the secret paths of the mountains. Here are some images of the Battle of Thermopylae. On the left is a relief of a Persian soldier, believed to be from India, actually. Here are some spear and arrow points found at the battle site. Here's an image of the Battle of Thermopylae. The mountain passes would have forced all the Persian immortals together, negating their large numbers, acting as a major force multiplier for the Greeks. But once the Persians found the mountain passes, they were able to surround the Greek position and destroy the much smaller Greek force. Here are some human remains found near the site. These remains attest to there being a battle in the region, as these bones often show signs of combat wounds. After the Battle of Thermopylae, the Persians destroyed the city of Athens, which only served to galvanize the Greek city-states against the Persians.
Although the Athenians had lost their city, they had not lost their navy, which was their greatest military asset. The Athenian strategos or general Themistocles recognized that the Greeks, and Athens especially, would need a large navy to defeat the Persians. He wanted to play to the strengths of the Greek people, which are seafaring strengths, their naval strengths. The Persians were not a seafaring civilization in the way the Greeks were. Most of the Persian navy was actually made up of other cultures, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, even some Ionian Greeks that had been basically pressed into service of Persia. So Themistocles wanted to take advantage of the naval weakness of the Persians and the division of the Persian navy in order to defeat them. Themistocles used silver from a mine discovered at Laurium in 483 BCE to pay for this fleet. That mine held over 100 talents, or about 100 million US dollars today, and the silver was minted into coins, which were used to purchase these ships. Coin-making technology was actually from Anatolia, from the east, but the Greeks adopted coin-making during this period, minting of coins during this period. Working-class Athenian men, the Thetes, who could not afford to become hoplites, could serve as rowers on Athenian warships called triremes. Here is a modern-day spelunker investigating the Laurium silver mines outside Athens. And these mines were, the silver from these mines were used to fund the Athenian navy. Here are some Athenian tetradrachmae, or Athenian coins. These are minted probably between 465 and 462 BCE, so a little bit later than Themistocles. But they feature the bust or profile of Athena, and then the owl, the symbol of Athena and the symbol of Athens. Here are some reconstructed images of triremes. Triremes were called triremes because they had 3 rows of oars. Triremes typically had about 200 crew aboard, mostly rowers, but there would be a complement of 8 to 10 archers and hoplites who would fight on the upper deck, basically as marines. During battle, the sails would be pulled down, and then the ship would just be powered by its oars. Triremes were very fast and very maneuverable, even without a keel and a rudder. Instead, they were actually steered by 2 large oars on the back of the ship, at the stern of the ship. But these ships were very unstable in open sea because of these large open areas. So they would actually have to be put ashore at night so that sailors could rest in peace and not worry about their ship sinking as they slept. And of course, conditions aboard these triremes were very unpleasant, very cramped, dirty, uncomfortable. People in the rows above you sweating on you, people bleeding on you, or other really uncomfortable, dirty, cramped conditions. So even though this was a good way for poor men to serve in the Greek military, it could be very dangerous and very unpleasant as well. And also remember that these men were not slaves. They were not galley slaves. They were there of their own volition because military service was part of their citizenship. But the service still could be very, very difficult at the same time. Here is another modern recreation of a Greek trireme. You can see a ram on the front of the vessel. These triremes, they would row into battle, and they would try to sink enemy ships with their rams. The Greeks their ships were much more maneuverable than the Persian vessels, so they had an easier time sinking the Persian ships. Also, archers and hoplites would be on the upper decks to fire at the arrows at enemy ships. These recreated vessels are based on archaeological research, based on documentary sources about ancient Greek ships, but there's also quite a bit of speculation that goes into building these vessels. So archaeologists work together with engineers and shipbuilders to try to figure out how these ships were built and then how they would have performed in battle. And actually, they'll take modern people and they'll have modern people row these ships to see how fast they could go, how maneuverable they were. This is called experimental archaeology for those that are interested. in archaeological terminology. And again, these triremes, even though they were very effective in naval combat, they were not very good on open seas. All of these open compartments meant that the ship could take on water very easily, and they would basically be bounced around in the waves, and they could sink very easily. So ideally, triremes would put ashore at night to try to avoid storms and to give their crews a rest.
In the wake of the destruction of Athens, the Greek navy fought a Persian armada at Salamis on the 26th to the 27th of September, 480 BCE. The Greek navy was outnumbered 4-1, but it won a major victory thanks to its faster trireme ships. Their strategy was also better. They forced the much larger Persian fleet to face them in a small bay, negating the Persian fleet's much larger size. Keep in mind that many of the Persian vessels were actually Ionian Greek vessels that had been pressed into service in the Persian armed forces. The Greek vessels, though, were faster, and they rammed the Persian ships and sank many of them, ultimately routing the remaining Persian ships.
These are some shots of a underwater archaeological excavation, an investigation of a Greek port at Salamis. This port probably would have been used as a naval command center for the Greek Navy, which would have helped the Athenian vessels coordinate and launch at the right times to attack the Persians. And you can see the diver investigating the foundation of the port here in this slide, and you can also see that archaeologists, underwater archaeologists, have erected barriers around the site. That way the water can be pumped out and they can investigate the site without having to put on a diving suit and be underwater. Because underwater archaeology is very challenging and can be very dangerous as well.
The Greek naval victory at Salamis greatly weakened the Persian military's invasion of Greece. It led to the Battle of Plataea in August of 479 BCE. And the Battle of Plataea fought to the south in the Peloponnesian Peninsula. 80,000 Greeks defeated between 70 and 120,000 Persians. In this battle, both sides were a lot closer in size. The Persians, under General Mardonius, were overconfident. They charged the Greek position, only to be pushed back after General Mardonius was killed. The Persians had some Greek subjects and allies fighting on their side, but these Greek conscripts fought poorly, probably due to low morale. They probably didn't want to fight with the Persians against other Greeks, especially after what happened at Thermopylae in Athens. In the end, the Greeks were victorious at the Battle of Plataea, and their victory there brought an end to the major Persian invasions of the Greek mainland. After the battle, the Greeks would go on the offensive and retake their colonies in Ionia until about 449 BCE, when the Greeks made peace with the Achaemenid Empire, emerging from their conflict with Persia victorious. The Greco-Persian Wars were a very significant event in both Greek and Achaemenid history. The war weakened the Achaemenid Empire, setting the stage for its defeat by Alexander the Great in the 330s BCE. At the same time, it strengthened the Greek city-states, specifically Athens and Sparta. The war strengthened and galvanized Greek identity and culture, prompting the cultural achievements of the late classical period. It brought the city-states together, but only temporarily. Former allies, Sparta and Athens, would go to war against each other in the Peloponnesian War of 431 through 404 BCE. This conflict weakened the Greek city-states and set the stage for the Macedonian takeover of Greece in 338 BCE, leading to the Hellenistic Age. Conclusion. Greek culture developed significantly during the Archaic and early Classical period. Pottery, sculpture, and architecture advanced significantly and became more sophisticated. Initially, the Greeks borrowed from other cultures, but they soon became innovators in all of these fields. Greek society was more egalitarian and democratic during the Archaic and early Classical period, once again, by the standards of the ancient world. The Greek social arrangement in this period, small farms, an agricultural middle class, inspired the hoplite system, which allowed the greatly outnumbered Greek city-states to defeat the much larger Achaemenid Empire. Additionally, this agricultural system facilitated the rise of Greek democracy as well. We'll discuss Greek democracy and Greek culture further in our next video.